This lecture is about estimating and bidding jobs. So the process of determining how much a particular landscape contracting job will cost and giving an estimation for the costs and materials, including labor, and the difference between estimations and bids. So when you approach a job, a client calls you or one is referred to you and you set up a time and you go to the site and you look around and they describe what they want. One of the first things you need to do is just decide which is needed, an estimate or a bid. So you don't instantly go to how much it's going to cost and how much that money you can do the job for. You want to find out, is this person just looking for an actual bid, which a bid can be turned into a formal official contract, like a legally binding contract. So you have to decide, is the client just interested in finding out more in general about what you can do? Like, oh, can you do this job? What's it gonna maybe cost? What will it entail? How much do you think about what it will cost? That kind of thing. That's just an estimate. And so early on, you don't want to waste time on an estimate if one isn't needed. So if you're going to go straight to a bid, the person says they want to have you bid out the job for whatever amount, then you want to know that right away. But if they want an estimate first, you can give them that. If they just want to talk about the job and not have an estimate or a bid, that's possible too. So like it says here on the bottom, don't waste time on an estimate if one is not needed. So sometimes you can also just do a job without either of those things. Sometimes you can make an agreement with somebody that doesn't have to do with an estimate or a bid. But if they want something that's going to be more formalized, that would be creating a bid. If they want something less formal, just an estimate. Like when you go to the auto mechanic, they can give you an estimate about what it's going to cost, but that doesn't mean that they're bound to keep it at that cost. When you do create a bid, which has all the labor and materials and all the costs involved itemized and totaled, that bid often and can be made into a legally binding contract. So another thing that distinguishes an estimate or a bid is that a bid is much more detailed and more comprehensive, really itemizing everything. An estimate is more general. It does include costs of materials and labor, but it's more general. And again, the estimate means you have a general idea. You're giving the client a general idea of what it will cost, but you're not, there's a range that it could cost. It's not a one number. Like a bid is actually itemizing it and saying, here's what it's going to cost to put in that patio, $10,000. An estimate would be like saying it's going to cost about this, and here's in general the costs and expenses involved in this. So bids are more detailed for sure and come up with one number. And often also another difference between estimate and bid is that a bid, kind of just by nature of the word bid, is usually done when you have a number of contractors put their bid in for that project. You could get landscape company A, say I'd like a bid for this 10 by 10 patio made out of flagstone, grout, joints, underlain with gravel and sand, and you give the exact same specs out to a couple other contractors, landscape company B and landscape company C, and they all give you a bid on that project, and you compare them. Since you've given them all the exact same specs or specifications, and they usually a plan too, they should produce bids that are all comparing apples to apples. They will all be able to be compared and see which one is the one you want to go with. If you work for a public agency like City College, I've had bids put in for a number of projects we've done around campus, mostly in the Lifescape Garden, and we'll do a walkthrough where I invite 6 to 10 different contractors to come. I hand them all the same sheet of all the specs of a project. I had paths put in the Lifescape Garden made out of Buellton shale, and I did a walkthrough. I had 9 contractors. They all got the exact same photocopied sheet of specs. They walked through and I explained the project. Since they were all together, they heard the exact same explanation and they all put together a bid. And because I'm working for a public agency, We have to take a number of bids, and then we have to choose the lowest bid of those. If you're a private person, you want the patio put in yourself, then you could put your project out to bid and to a number of companies and see which one you want to go with. Sometimes you'll go with the cheapest. Sometimes you'll go with maybe the middle of the road. It depends what you're looking for. The unfortunate thing about public agencies, so they force us to choose the lowest bid to make sure that it's fair and we're getting something least expensive. But it also often happens that then you have to choose the company that does the lowest quality work too. So that's a negative. So an estimate is general. A bid is much more specific. A bid can be just from one contractor, but by nature of the word bid, and it's usually something that's used when you are having a number of contractors bid on the same project. Reading down through the actual slide here, an estimate is lower detail, not a firm price. If a price can be made firm from an estimate, and you can convert that into a bid or contract, and to calculate a bid, a design must exist that all the bidders use, like I said, having a walkthrough done. Here's just an example of a form you might use, a template for creating a job estimate. You've got materials that will be listed there. You've got the description of the work, labor charges, hours, the rate, etc., and a total. But it's still pretty general. Just by looking at it, you have one sheet. You're not going to be as detailed as a bid would be. Here is another example of an estimate sheet, but this one is filled out. And this one is different. It has a lot more detail. Looking at it, Mary Green wants a deck, 10 by 10 deck with rails and stairs, including this staining of the deck. And they've got all kinds of detail here. The paint, permits, travel, etc., quantity, unit price of materials, hours, labor for each of those things, and a total price of $9,088.88. So for this estimate is very detailed, but the thing that makes it not a bid is that the contractor is not bound to keep it at that price. It could end up being $12,000, and that would be okay as far as when the client just gets an estimate and they say, okay, go ahead and start. I don't mind. I like your estimate. That's fine, but you're not bound to keep it at that cost. I mean, you would try. But if it was a bid, it's a contract that can be made into a contract. You both sign it saying, like, now the contractor has to only charge that amount for that project, no matter what. So that's a difference there. There are all kinds of things that go into calculating a bid or an estimate. They both need, especially a bid needs exact costs, but you have to be creative. The client, working with the client, knowing what they want and what they can afford and kind of what they're willing to pay. And also your ability to interpret plans and create the specifications or specs from drawings. So you need blueprint reading skills. And we do actually have a great blueprint reading class that's in our construction technology department. You need to be able to research cost estimations of different parts of a project, maybe grading of the soil, installation of drainage materials, building of walls, building of decks. And as you progress in your profession, one of the most important things that will help you accurately estimate jobs are your past jobs. So as you take on a job, you keep really detailed records of how each part of a job, how long it took, how much labor was involved, how many people you needed, things like that. So you know when you get to the next job, let's say the first job you do is building, a privacy fence for somebody between their neighbor and them. And they wanted it to be 6 feet tall and wooden and pretty basic dog-eared panels, etc. And but so you figured out how long it took you to dig, each post hole, how much concrete was used for each post, how long it took to install the rails and the post boards and everything in between. So you would kind of break that down, and let's say that first job was a 100-foot fence. The next one is 200 feet, but it has a turn in it, and it has a gate. You would at least have some of that information from the first job about how long each panel took, how long each hole took to dig, how much concrete was used for each hole, and you can just use that kind of as a multiplier for the next job. So that's the best way to really understand and do good, accurate cost estimations. There's always going to be some things that you don't know about, so you do usually have to include contingency costs, build them into your estimate, things that come up that you couldn't plan for. Knowing about your labor force is really important too, how many people you need to get a job done, and keep it kind of at that same pace of how many maybe square feet per hour you can do on a patio or a deck or a pathway, and the people, which people can keep that work rate up and which can't. Maybe you get your best two fastest crew members get sick, and you've got to use the ones that aren't quite as fast, and so that changes the whole plan, and it changes the cost to you, perhaps the client. But as you go, you can learn those things and build in enough kind of buffer so you don't get caught getting underpaid. Cost reference guides are useful. They're not perfect in estimating landscaping tasks and how much things will cost and how long they'll take, but they help. Like 4 of the cost estimation guides out there that are published guides, Means, Sweets, Carey, Dodge, they will all be able to give you estimates on length of time and materials and labor for different types of very common landscaping jobs like fencing, trenching, wall building, patios, decking, etc. These have to be adjusted for your location. So these are just these are not, what's the word? They are general. So if you look up the cost of a wooden fence, how much it costs per lineal foot for materials and for how long it takes for labor, and this is, you're applying it to your job that's in Ohio, that's going to be a different cost than if you apply that same project in Santa Barbara or in California. It depends on where you are in California, but let's say coastal, warm California. So the prices are going to be different. The materials are going to have a different cost. The labor is going to have a different rate. So you use these guides as a rough guide, and then you adjust it to your location. And that's the way to use these guides. And then there are always some other things too that are more like specific regulatory restrictions and influences on your costs, things that are like county building codes, county ordinances, special regulations for work hours, limitations on what you can do with existing plants or not. The labor costs change and for each particular job and place. I mean, if you start a landscaping company after you go through our program and you only work in Santa Barbara, this isn't gonna, you'll learn about all the requirements within the Santa Barbara County and even the city that you have to go by, and that's all you need to learn pretty much. But if you start to venture out to a different county, a different state, you'll have different influences that you'll need to adjust your bids and estimates for. One thing I know about is, like, for example, coast live oak trees are protected in our county. Any tree over 6-inch diameter at chest height is protected by the county, and you can't cut it down just to get it out of the way, even if the client says, oh, that tree, it's kind of scraggly, doesn't look so good, and I want it out of here because I'm putting a pool in, or etc. You cannot do that. You can apply for a special permit to do that, but in general, they're protected. And when you're doing a construction project, their root zones have to be protected too. So something to think about, and that's just Santa Barbara County. Other counties have similar types of ordinances or covenants, but they will have varying influences on your cost. Labor costs are usually the thing that's the most variable of a project. The materials costs, not so much. They're pretty consistent, but labor costs can change a lot. The situation, your workforce, like I said, some are more skilled workers and some are less skilled, some are faster, some are slower, some get sick more often, etc. And then the types of things they have to do too. Overhead is other costs we'll go into in a minute, and that has a lot of different types of costs involved. And then your contingencies, 5 to 10% is added on to most materials and even sometimes labor to make sure that you have enough. You don't write that in there in your bid. You don't say contingency, I'm adding this extra in case I break some of the sandstone pavers or if some of my workers get sick, but you increased your costs for those just to hedge your bet. And don't forget, profit is needed to be put in there too. You're not just covering your costs and paying your workers. You need to make profit to not just pay for the overhead, but also so you have money. You know, the owner makes money too. Calculating materials costs. Usually a design is created for the site. If you become a landscape architect, you'll be creating the official permitted designs. If not, you'll have to have a landscape architect sign off on them, unless you're doing an informal design for a project that's less than $500 total cost. But the designs, you have to be able to interpret them and look at the designs and determine what are the materials that are needed for that project. And so something called a takeoff is created, and that can be done sometimes by the vendor or supplier, like Hayward Lumber here in town or Santa Barbara Stone will do Aquaflow too, a takeoff for you, like show you what the prices are going to be for all these things that you are needing for a specific project and tell you the cost. They can do that, but you have to be able to do that too. And you're just kind of taking off that line item of the project and looking at the cost of it to make that happen, like all the sandstone pavers, all the base material that goes under the pavers. What's that going to cost? And just needing to know how to figure out volumes and lineal footage and square footage, and I'm converting that to how much the costs are going to be for that. The quantities of materials. Bulk materials should always be over-ordered, again for contingency and because they vary with application to the site. If you're ordering base material for under a pathway or a patio, something like that, like kind of like road base, gravel, you don't want to end up with not enough and have to get another truckload delivered, which is about $75 per truckload, but order a little bit more than needed just in case. Plants too. When you're ordering plants for a landscape job, you're usually always going to have at least 5% mortality of what you plant that during that time period, a couple of days, you've got your whole landscape, you recontoured the land, you put in the underground irrigation system, put in the hardscaping, the patios, the paths, and then you put in the plants. But most, there's a good chunk of those plants will not survive. So you always need to over-order those as well, or at least plan for that. As I said earlier, calculating labor cost is perhaps the most difficult part of estimating, and you'll get better and better at it as time goes by. Always kind of keep track of the hours per unit for different types of tasks that you get started doing. It's like the number of hours it takes a laborer to complete one unit of a task. So you think of one worker and how long it takes that worker to build one lineal foot of wooden fence. Or, of course, the type of wooden fence would be important to know too. Or the lineal, how long it takes one worker to build one lineal foot of stone wall, or cinder block stucco wall, or dig a trench 8 to 12 inches deep, how long it takes to do 1 foot of that, using a trenching machine or by hand, how long it takes one worker to lay 1 square foot of like Oklahoma sandstone patio, or prefab unit patio pavers, things like that. So you want to break it down to the smallest unit to be able to translate that and use that in the next job, how long it will take you for something that's similar but of different size and dimension. And of course, as I mentioned a little bit before, there's always contingencies. The costs will change even if you get all of the materials, just dialed in, the cost and even the labor. You're going to have some things that you just can't account for. People get sick, equipment breaks down, things take longer, you run into underground gas lines or water lines that you didn't know they were there and no one else knew they were there. Weather can come in the way, a big snowstorm or rain delays it, and then your materials also can be delayed, their delivery, that's very common. So usually 5 to 10% is added on for labor and material costs just for a contingency. That would include also the contingency I talked about before with just breakage and plant death. Just kind of on everything you want to add a little bit more in case. And then worker efficiency changes too. Think about that. You might have, if you're trying to keep track of how long it takes that one worker to build one lineal foot of standard wooden fence, they might be able to do, that might take them, 2 hours on Monday, but it would take 3 on Friday. They can get tired, they can get worn out, they can get bored. So efficiencies of labor changes too. And that's just a real kind of general thing you're going to have to really think kind of holistically. And you can keep really detailed notes, but some part of you is going to have to learn and gain intuition too about this with certain work crews, and the ability of them to work at a certain rate will shift and change, and you'll have to get a kind of a feel for that on your own. Lastly, as far as the costs and estimation and calculating goes, overhead costs. There's 2 types of overhead, assignable and unassignable. Assignable is the non-labor and non-material costs that can be directly attributed to a project. So permits that are needed for that project, maybe a permit to do an addition or a greenhouse on the side of a house, which changes the structure, so you need a permit, or equipment rentals, special insurance or bonding for that project, temporary utility costs. You might have to bring in extra electricity or a panel just for the construction. Those are things that can be assigned to a project and then the client pays. Unassignable is stuff your company has to pay. You can't make the client pay for the shovels that you own, or the tools that are used in all the jobs, or to pay for your payroll or office expenses or sick days. Those are things that have to be included in your bid and estimate implicitly. They're not stated on that, but your costs of labor and your costs of mostly labor, you wouldn't do it in materials, but mostly in just the labor has to be enough above your cost so it can include to pay for these things too, including, like I said, your profit, but also all these unassignable overhead costs. Here are 2 examples of bids that are completed, and they have detailed description of the scope of the work and line items of what's going to be involved and the prices. The one on the left has more typically detail as far as exactly what's going to be the costs are for the landscape and the lightscape and the irrigation. Both would require signatures of the client and the contractor on the bottom to turn this into a formal bid, which becomes a legally binding contract. Also, don't forget that as far as calculating profit, and how much should you charge for profit? Probably at the beginning of your career, you'll kind of tend to underbid things. You want to do things, you want to be the one that does it more cheaply, and you might not have as much confidence, so you don't want to charge people too much. You're trying to just gain a reputation, gain experience. You're excited to have a client. But when you do start, over time, you'll start to dial in what you feel you're worth and what you want to charge for profit, and what you can ask too. You don't want to ask for too much or you won't get clients. So I'm looking at the current market. What do other people charge in their landscape companies for labor, et cetera, or for similar types of jobs? What is the competition charging? What do you need for income, to make your company stay afloat and to stay afloat? Pay your own personal expenses. Anticipation of upcoming business conditions is really important in landscaping because it's a seasonal thing. You've got a lot of people working and options for lots of clients in the spring and the summer. And that's when people want to do these have the landscaping jobs done because they're busy and things are growing and because it's the right time to plant plants. And you have to plan for, okay, this is looking great, but I've got to make enough money to get this company through the next winter when things go kind of dormant again, the plants, but also the business. And you want to be able to keep some of your workers on. So you got to think about that. You're going to be charging more than you normally would just because of the dry spells in the business. And ask also if there's other people, trusted financial advisors or trusted friends and colleagues that are landscapers. Most landscapers are not that competitive. You could go to a company, you get a name from somebody, like from me. I could tell you names of different landscape company owners that would be happy to sit down and tell you what they charge for their different types of projects and laborers and things like that. It's not that cutthroat. Okay, now we'll shift gears and let's talk a little bit about the actual landscape contractor's license exam. The license itself is called a C-27, so it's a state license. It's for landscape contracting. There's a separate one for contractors, for buildings and things like that. Often some of the landscape contractors I know are both landscape contractors. They become a general contractor sometimes so they can do more. And a couple of them have become contractors for building pools too. So, but the strict landscape contractor's license is the C-27. Let's talk about how you get that. But before we talk about how you get that, let's talk about why you would want that. So again, without a license, you can still work as a landscaper, but for jobs over $500 in cost, your client can legally not pay you for your work unless you have a license. So it's illegal to split up a job into different $500 chunks too. So if, Mr. Rodriguez next door says, I want you to take out my lawn and put in a succulent, garden in my front yard because I used to live in Oaxaca and I want to have some of those plants there and it's drought tolerant and I want to save water and whatever his reasons are, you say, okay, that would be about $1,500 is the estimate you guys come up with. And then you go ahead and you decide to do it. And then he says, oh, well, can I, when it comes down to being paid, he says, well, I found out you weren't licensed and I was hoping to have a licensed person do this. And I thought you were licensed. And you say, oh, no, I'm not yet, but I'm going to be soon. And he says, well, I'm not going to pay you. I don't have to pay you because this job is over $500 and you're not licensed and I legally don't have to. And you're like kind of pissed. You're like, wait a minute, I'm going to get my license really soon. What if I just charge you $500 now and then $500 again in the next couple of months? Well, that's not okay to do that either. That's called job splitting, and it's illegal. So you might want to get a license instead. The California State License Board is the California State licensing agency. It administers the exam for the C-27 license exam, and it gives the licenses out too. The phone number at the bottom here, 800-321-CSLB, is the board that gives out the exam and the licenses, and that's who you would call to deal with. I have talked to them a few times. The people that have answered the phone were really helpful, and they also were helpful in letting me know, like, this license board really works with you and is trying to help you get your license. They're not super, they're not such a huge company or government agency that they have it's not personal. They were very helpful in explaining how my students would get the exam get ready for the exam and get their license, and how they'd work with them on classes they probably needed to take and things like that. But they're really helpful. So give them a call if you have any interest in getting the license and get started on that process. Alrighty, let's talk about what you need to do to get your license. First step, obtain 4 years of experience at the journey level or as a foreman, supervising employee, contractor, or owner builder. So in one of those types of contracting roles, you need 4 years of experience prior to being licensed. So if you get your AS degree in horticulture, that works towards 1.5 years of the 4 years. A BS in horticulture, like from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo or Cal Poly Pomona, you would have 3 years towards the 4 years credited to you, and then would just need, for the BS, 1 more year of experience as a journeyman, foreman, supervising employee, or contractor, or owner builder. I have talked to the people at the California State License Board, and they said there's some wiggle room on, let's say you're working full-time for a licensed contractor in one of those 5 types of positions, and you're getting your AS degree, say at City College or somewhere else, that those time periods can be overlapping as well. So you wouldn't have to take you 4 whole years, but it could take a shorter period of time. You, however, cannot double dip on your hours if you're working at a job for the EH290, the work experience class in horticulture, and using those hours for credit for the class, that is how that class works. And you can't use those hours for credit and towards your license hours as well. And all of your hours have to be verified by a licensed, C27 licensed contractor. So you wouldn't just fill in the blank saying, yeah, I got 4 years of experience. They actually have to be signed off. Someone would have to say, yes, he or she has worked for me for 4 years in one of those 5. Well, they would be like a journeyman, foreman, supervising employee. If you worked for yourself, that can work too. You just have to somehow, I'm not sure how you do it, but you have to verify the hours and the number of years that you've done that, or as someone who builds, the owner builder, someone who has built their own home and lives in it. After that, step 1, you have to pass the C27 exam. There are some costs involved with that. There are prep courses to help you get started and get prepped for taking and passing the exam. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then you also have to obtain a bond. The California State License Board requires that you obtain a bond before you may receive the license. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. What is a bond? A bond is basically like you're buying insurance from a company, what we call a surety bond from an insurance carrier that will make sure that your clients and your vendors and suppliers and employees are paid in the case that you fail to fulfill a contract with a client. Somehow, if that happens and you can't complete the job according to your contract, you may not get paid by the client, and then you can't pay your vendors and suppliers and employees, etc. The bond, at least you have to have a bond of at least $15,000. That again is like buying insurance to make sure that those the people that work for you and the vendors get paid in that case. The bonds cost between $69 and $465, depending on personal credit, license history, and classification of you, the contractor. And it's like insurance, it gives you $15,000 of coverage, which is fine, but that's the minimum. It's really not that much when it comes to bigger landscaping jobs. But you need that as a third step to get your license. And then you're pretty much good. Those 3 steps have been fulfilled, and you're ready to go. So we'll go back to now, how do you pass the exam? All right, the C27 exam is 2-part. There's laws and trade. The law questions are a legal focus, how to obtain permits, how to handle inspections, general safety requirements to follow. And there are also trade questions. And those are the things we talk about mostly in this program, the environmental horticulture program. How do you perform the tasks involved in landscape contracting? There's 100 questions per part. It takes about 4 hours. It costs $250. And then, like I said, the license, I didn't say this before, but the license itself costs some money too. So you've got to go to school or get experience. You've also got to get that bond. You've got to pass the test and pay the fee for the test and then pay for the license. And then you have to keep paying every couple of years for your license too. Taken right off the CSLB website, the trade questions are going to be mostly, as you see here, the percentage of the questions on the exam are given here in parentheses. So 23% of the questions, it changes a little from year to year, but in general, are job estimation questions. So about a fourth of the questions on the exam will be about job estimation. Landscape design, about 15%. Site preparation, 13%. Hardscape, 9%. All these different subtopics that come under those headings are the types of questions you'll be asked. Here's some more topics, general topics for the trade questions: irrigation installation, plant material installation, job site safety, which has a little bit of overlap with the legal questions. So those are the main categories of trade questions, those 7 that I just mentioned from the last slide and this slide, and that covers most of it. So I've had lots of students take the exam, and I haven't heard anyone having big troubles with it. So it's not an extremely hard exam. You do have to study for it. There are prep courses and prep books. Our courses help you a lot too. You should do fine. Let's see. I know that some people have taken in-person prep courses. There's online prep courses. Of course, those cost money. But if you wanted to get your C27 license and you wanted to get a little bit of schooling, the 3 courses that would help you the best are landscape maintenance, landscape construction, and landscape irrigation. Those are the ones that are most focused on the landscape contracting profession and the landscape contractor's exam. So the next few slides are questions that are from the California State License Board, questions that have been on the exam. I'm not sure if they're still using them. When's the best time to remove thatch buildup in a cool season lawn? Basically, you're looking at which season here is the best time. And the answer is D, mid to late fall. And the reason is thatch are the overgrowth of stems of rhizomatous grasses, things like kikuyu, Bermuda grass, crabgrass, that build up in lawns. And the best time to remove any kind of above ground portion of a plant, especially a turf, would be the time when it goes dormant. And so that would be the late fall, when it starts to slow down in its growth period. A cool season lawn will grow during the winter. That's part of the reason it's called cool season, is it grows and it will stay green during the cool season. But its growth still slows down, so that's the time when you're going to be, and that when it slows down, that means the most of the storage of the carbohydrates and kind of just energy and resources goes into the roots. So the time to really cut that thatch down, and as a lawn gets thicker and thicker, sometimes it has to be like scalped or just cut way back till it looks brown and bad for a while, but you've got to do that or it'll just get too thick and suffocate itself. And that would be the time when it would be going somewhat dormant and and be damaged the least by being cut pretty harshly. Another question, what effect does lime have when added to the soil? Does it increase the pH, decrease, increase potassium, decrease potassium? in this case, lime is added to a soil that's too acidic. So lime is mostly calcium carbonate. It will make the soil more alkaline, less acidic, and a less acidic soil has a higher pH. The pH scale is kind of backwards. If we talk about acidity a lot, so the higher the acidity, the lower the pH. So the correct answer is A. If the gallons per minute or the flow rate changes from 8 to 12 in an irrigation system, how would the water velocity be affected? Would it increase? Would it remain the same? Would it decrease by 2, decrease by 4? Well, if you increase the flow rate, it's not going to decrease the velocity. It's going to either increase it or remain the same, but when it goes from 8 to 12, it's definitely an increase. So A is the correct answer. If a plant requires good drainage, what type of backfill material should be used? Shale, loam, clay, or silt? Well, silt and clay are fairly small particles and they will get pretty compacted, so they're not going to be very well draining. Loam is well draining, but not as a backfill material. Backfill is not a topsoil. Backfill is to fill in areas for the subsoil that were maybe somehow the contour of the land needs to be filled in. So something like shale would be better to underlie the topsoil where the plants are that need good drainage. What is the maximum distance between joints in a 4-inch thick concrete patio? 8, 10, 12, 14 feet? The answer is 12 feet. The spaced joints no more than 2 to 3 times the slab thickness in inches. So a 4-inch slab should have joints approximately 12 feet apart. Most common option to prepare for the C27 licensing test is to do an online course or a CD study guide. There's lots of online, in-person, and hybrid options for test prep courses. There's a good summary of what to expect with this link here to a YouTube on the exam. And a good organization to join would be the California Landscape Contractors Association, which is different than the CSLB. But join their website. Their LinkedIn discussion group for the CLCA is really good. Lots of great tips from contractors discussing different topics and problems with maintaining fruit tree orchards or failing retaining walls, etc. I've paid attention to that discussion group for a long time and learned a lot. Attend a local chapter meeting of the CLCA, Channel Islands chapter, and you can get more information from them on testing and licensing. And there you go. Good luck.